Good evening. It is good to be with you again. Good to be back with the family. We continue this evening in our preaching series through the book of Genesis. There are 8 lessons in this series. This is number 5 today. We've gotten through 4 so far. We've talked about the fact that Genesis is the book of beginnings. We've talked about the fact that the book of Genesis comprises roughly 2,700 years of history. And we've talked about the fact that Genesis chapters 1 through 11 comprise about 2,500 of those 2,700 years. We've had 3 lessons getting us to Abraham. The story of the Bible is the story of Jesus. The Bible can be condensed down into these 3 main themes. Jesus is coming, the Old Testament. Jesus has come, the Gospels. And Jesus is coming again, the rest of the New Testament. The Bible can be prized into the generation of man, the degeneration of man, and the regeneration of man. So the Bible is the story of Jesus because he was the one who was going to come, who has come, to deal with our sin problem that we might be reconciled with the Father. Jesus was promised, and so the Bible is also, in many ways, the story of the promise. So why do we have from Genesis chapter 1 in Genesis through Genesis chapter 11, 2,500 years taking place, more than the rest of the Bible combined? Well, the reason we talked about was that it's about that promise. And the promise that was given in Genesis 3 and verse 15 isn't changed. It's only focused in Abraham in chapter 11, at the end of chapter 11. And so, basically following the promise, what happened for 2,500 years? Why don't we have it all recorded? Because, in general, nothing happened with regards to the promise. People were born. People grew up, people got married, people had children, people passed away. Their children grew up, their children got married, their children had children. Life continued apace until we get to Abraham when it is focused. And so then suddenly we slow down in chapter 12 of Genesis. In chapter 12 through 50, by roughly 200 years, we slow way down. Because now we're going person by person. Our character study approach to the book of Genesis is because it's about the promise. And the promise is about people. In Genesis in the garden, we had the promise given to Adam and Eve. Then we had the promise focused in Abraham. Then we had the promise refocused in Isaac, refocused in Jacob, and continuing on. So we get to Abraham, and our character studies are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and Joseph. Now, I know Joseph doesn't really have anything to do with the promise per se. He's not of the seed line, but there's a lot of good information there. So we've gotten to chapter 12, and we've talked about Abraham, the great father of faith. We noticed in his life that he indeed was faithful. God called him out of his city of Ur, and he went, and he continued to went until he died. Wherever God said go, he went. We talked about this great man of faith, but that he was not perfect. He stumbled in Egypt. He stumbled in Gerar. He stumbled with Hagar. He was not perfect, but he was faithful. And he believed God, and because of that, it was accounted to him for righteousness, Genesis 15 and verse 6. And that faithfulness, this ought to lighten up all of our days, that faithfulness allowed him to be called the friend of God. Wouldn't you like that to be said about you after your life? He was a friend of God. Indeed. Now we're going to talk this evening about Abraham's son, the son of promise, Isaac. Isaac is an extremely interesting character in the Bible. And maybe Isaac is more interesting, at least to me, and since I'm allowed to talk, it has to be somewhat interesting to you, on how much we don't know about Isaac. We don't know a whole lot. I think there's less said about Isaac than any other of the promised lines. Remember, the promise was given to the woman. It was focused in Abraham. And then we have that promise re-given to Isaac, re-given to Jacob, and then we don't have it focused again until maybe David. The promise that was given to Judah was about authority, not necessarily that seed promise that we hear. And we talked about why is that? I believe it's tied to that principle that God established in the Old Testament and that carries on in the New Testament of, by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, all things will be established. So Abraham was told, in your seed, all the nations of the world will be blessed. His son Isaac, in your seed, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Jacob, his son, in your seed, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And then we don't have it continuing forward. Why? It's been established. Now, the Bible just follows the seed line. Of those 3, Isaac has the least said about him. We don't hear much about him. How many lessons have you heard from the pulpit about Isaac? We hear about him getting tricked, and we hear about some wells being dug, right? Not much else. Well, let's consider Isaac this evening. Because like I said, there's something to be learned that maybe we've overlooked. To begin, let's consider the fact that Isaac was willing. Isaac, in many ways, was raised in the church. You understand what I mean by that, brethren? Isaac was born to a man of God, the friend of God, in a family that was dedicated to following God. And he grew up in that family, and he was a man of God. And because of that, I believe that is a lot of the reason we don't hear so much about or from Isaac. But I want you to consider what he did do in his faith. Isaac was willingly given. Turn to Genesis chapter 22, and we're going to be all just in Genesis. We're not going to go anywhere else, so I won't pull my normal trick and scoot all over there. But look at Genesis 22. This is the great test of Abraham's faith. He was promised a child with his wife Sarah, but he was old, and his wife was beyond the years where most women would have children. She was apparently barren. Yet God had promised. And they struggled a little bit with their belief, and because of that, God delayed the fulfilling of that promise. Then God delivered on the promise. And here's the son, and the son is weaned, and the son is growing up. And at chapter 22, Isaac is probably 18, maybe as old as 20 years old, brethren. I know in our, church building coloring books, they always show Isaac as like a little toddler or as a little kid. He was much older than that. He was a grown man. And what was Abraham commanded to do? To take this young lad, to take him up to a mountain and sacrifice him. Okay. How old was Abraham? If Isaac was 18, how old was Abraham? He was about 118 years old. I'm not stupid fast, but I bet I could outrun a 100-year-old. I'm hoping I could. Look at verse 7 of chapter 22. As they're making their way up the mountain, Abraham has already said to the young men that accompanied him, "You stay here. The lad and I are going to go up to worship, and we will come back to you." So Abraham, verse 6, took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, because he's 100 years old. I mean, give him a break. The boy can carry it. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father, and he said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." I love this shtick of the Old Testament. I love that. And God said to Isaiah, "Isaiah." And Isaiah said, "Here I am." I love that. We should do that in all of our families. "Deirdre!" And she just goes, "Here I am." I like that. We've lost something. He says, "Here I am, my son," because they're walking together, right? Then he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Isaac has done this before. Abraham is an altar-building man, He has offered sacrifices. Isaac has seen his father offering sacrifices. He told the guys they were going to go up and offer a sacrifice. Isaac's carrying the wood, and he's looking around, and he's going, something's missing. Dad, what's the deal? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Do you think Abraham had to wrestle Isaac to the ground to tie him up? Do you think a 118-year-old man, I understand things were different, he lived to be 175, but do you think that's what had to happen? Brethren, I don't think so. Even in that circumstance, I think an 18-year-old boy could probably have gotten away. I believe the boy willingly submitted to it and gave himself to it. I think it's something we don't talk about and that's understated and that needs to be said about Isaac. Consider that. I believe Isaac gave himself as well as God, or as well as Abraham offering him up. Isaac willingly gave himself to God and then willingly gave himself to Rebekah. You remember the situation. Abraham wanted to get a wife after the death of Sarah for his son Isaac. But he, of course, didn't want to get a wife from the people around them, because those would be Canaanites who don't worship God. Those would have been Hittites, maybe Egyptians, who knows, living there. So he sent one of his servants. Do you remember he had one of his servants come to him, and he charged his servants with going back to Haran, going back to where much of the family of Abraham that left Ur stayed. So they would have been familiar with Jehovah God, worshipers of Jehovah God. So he sent his servant up there to get a wife for Rebekah, and she came back and was given to Isaac. Look at verses 64 through 67 of chapter 24. Then Rebekah lifted her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from her camel. For she had said to the servant, who is this man walking in the field to meet us? The servant said, it is my master. So she took a veil and covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. He's never seen this woman. He's never met this woman. She came to him and put a veil on before he even met her. And yet she is his wife according to the will of his father, that he have a wife who is godly. And Isaac complied. Isaac willingly gave himself and was comforted. And then in chapter 25, verses 9 through 11, Abraham has died, and his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, the Scottish cave, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. And mark it, brethren. And it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac. And Isaac dwelt at Beer Lahai Roi. That promise was officially passed over. Abraham had been the carrier of that promise, and now it is officially upon Isaac. Again, he has given himself willingly to God. Think about that. Isaac was blessed. He was blessed with children. Chapter 25 and verse 21. Notice what we read. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren. Well, what's this about? It's an interesting thing in the Old Testament, especially in this line, this barrenness. We don't see it a lot, and then suddenly we see it with Sarah, and we see it with Rebekah, and then we're going to see it with Rachel, aren't we? What is this about? Is it actually that they were barren and couldn't have children? Did they grow up next to Chernobyl or something? Brethren, I think it was God's way of just showing his hand working in these things. I think God is who made Sarah barren. in his providence that he might give them a child and they might know for sure this is from God. And here's young Rebekah given to, well, not so young Isaac, and they can't have a child. She's barren. Why? I think God is working his will again, that they might know this is from me, not from anyone else. It's similar, forgive the illustration. You remember Gideon raised an army against the 132,000 Midianites? And he gathered an army. You remember what God said? You got way too many guys. And he whittled his army down to 300. Why? Because you're going to win, but I want you to understand it's me doing this. I think that's what this barrenness is. It's God's way of saying, this is me moving the promise forward. But here in chapter 25, 21, we'll finish that verse. She was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Not only was he given a child as a blessing, but he was given a child of promise. Just like his father had been promised a child, God gives Isaac a child of promise. Because what do we find? There are 2 children in the womb. Look at verse 22. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, if all is well, why am I like this? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb, and the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over, so they called his name Esau, which means hairy. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So there are 2 children here. The parallels between Isaac and Abraham, and even with Jacob, are so interesting with regards to their children. Abraham had an older son, didn't he? Named Ishmael. And the promise was not through Ishmael, it was through his younger son, Isaac. Well, here, Isaac has 2 children, twins. And his wife Rebekah is told it is not going to be the older through whom the promise is going to come, it's going to be the younger. Jacob's name is interesting too. And obviously, stories come from the Bible and words come from the Bible. Jacob means heel holder, or maybe better, supplanter, underneath the planter in your foot. And what does supplant mean as a verb? It means to take what is not yours. So it's interesting that his name, and again, it's probably because that's the story that gave us the word supplant, but chicken or the egg. So we have 2 children, and Rebekah's been told. And then we have this interesting preview. It's always interesting how the Bible gives us information. There's this little story after this. Okay, God has said to Rebekah, it's the younger who's going to be the one in charge. The younger is going to be the one who rules. That's different than normal. I mean, the firstborn is the firstborn. But nope, this is going to be the younger ruling. And then we get this little scene in chapter 26, 1 through 16. The story is that Esau is out hunting. And he comes in and he is ravenous. He is hungry. And Jacob has made some food. There's some pottage there. And Esau says, give me some or I'm going to die. You remember what Jacob said? Jacob said, I'll give it to you, but you have to give me your birthright. Which is a pretty strange thing out of the blue to say, right? I don't think there's anything out of the blue with this. My opinion is that when Rebekah was told by God that the younger would rule over the older, that she communicated that. That Isaac would have known that. And maybe at least Jacob would have known of this that happened. Doesn't have to be the case. My wife disagrees. She seems to think the wife wouldn't tell the husband some things. And, hey. So, I think that's what's going on, and I think this little story is trying to show us the wisdom of God in the decision that he made. Because what does Esau say with this offer? He says, take it. Take my birthright. What good is my birthright if I die of starvation? And this is just giving us a hint of Esau's profane nature. I don't mean that he cursed a lot. He may have cursed a lot. What I mean is he wasn't a religious man. He seemed to be a very earthly man, worried about physical things. What about your birthright? My birthright is something that's in the future, down the road. It's ethereal. I'm hungry right now. That's what he was focused on. And that's what we tend to see with his character throughout. So Jacob was, if you want to call it a prophecy, the command of God was that the younger would rule. And then we have this little image of, well, see, Esau gave away his right to be the firstborn. And then time goes on. And then, remember, we're talking about Isaac, not Jacob. Just most of the story of Isaac is about his sons. But we have this interesting stumble in chapter 26, 1 through 16. You remember his father Abraham stumbled in Egypt and then in Gerar of the Philistines with regards to his wife Sarah. Sarah was so beautiful that Abraham was worried that they would kill him in order to take her. And so he asked her to lie and say that she was his sister, which was a half-truth because she was his sister, same father, different mothers. And that happened twice. Well, here, we now have the story in chapter 26. Isaac, there's a famine in the land. You remember, that's how it began in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 9. There was a famine in the land, and Abraham had to go down to Egypt to get food. Are you going to hear that again through his descendants? Yes. So Isaac, there's a famine. So Isaac probably thinks about going to Egypt, but God tells Isaac, do not go to Egypt. So he doesn't. He goes to the Philistine city of Gerar. And there he meets Abimelech. Abimelech may be just a title. Because you remember, Abraham had some interaction with a king of Gerar named Abimelech. Abimelech means father king. So it may have just been a title. Kind of like later in history, and when we're studying about the northern kingdom of Israel, they're always interacting with Syria and the king Ben-Hadad. Well, Ben-Hadad apparently lived 500 years because there's always this Ben-Hadad because it was just a title for the kings. Candace, the Ethiopian queen, it wasn't a name, it was a title. And I think that's what we have here with Abimelech and even his general that accompanies him both with Abraham and with Isaac, Phicol. Phicol means the voice of all. I instantly thought of the voice of Sauron. That's who this guy that accompanies with. He's the one that does the talking maybe for Abimelech. Anywho, they go to Gerar, and Isaac has the same fear. We're going to go be around these Philistines, and my wife Rebekah is just as beautiful as my mother was. I'm worried they're going to kill me so that they can be with you. And so he lied. And he didn't ask Rebekah to lie. He said, she is my sister. And Abimelech is looking out one day, and he sees Isaac and Rebekah together, and they're not acting like a brother and sister. And so he goes to him and he says, what have you done? Is she your wife? Do you understand the trouble you could have caused? Same thing that Abimelech said to Abraham. Same thing that Pharaoh said to Abraham. Isaac has that same stumble. But in general, the blessings of God, look at chapter 26 and verse 12. Because of this misunderstanding, you remember Abraham was ceremonially escorted out of Egypt after that. Well, Isaac is kind of encouraged to leave Gerar proper, and he goes and settles in the valley of Gerar. In verse 12 we read, then Isaac sowed in that land, and he reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. Isaac was a man blessed of God. Then we run into this situation or section of his life I call Isaac in the wells. Because all we hear about Isaac is, and he's not even digging the wells. It's his servants that are digging the wells. So they've been asked to kind of leave the Gerar proper. They're out in the edges, and they dig a well. And the Philistines come out, and they say, that's our well. We want it. Get out. Because of that, Isaac named the well Issac, which means contention. And they left it, and they moved farther away from Gerar. And then they dug another well. And the Philistines came out to there, and they said, this is our well. We're taking this. So Isaac called that well Sitnah, which means strife. And he conceded it, and he moved farther away. And then Isaac had another well built, and this one they didn't come to get. So he called it Rehoboth, which means wide places. God has given us a space, finally, that we may settle. Why do we hear about this? Well, what is it teaching us? I think it teaches us that Isaac was a man of peace, seeking peace. Isaac was of a large number of people. His father had many, many servants. You may remember that his father, with only 318 servants, went and fought against the 4 kings who had defeated the 5 kings, and he whooped them and took their stuff. Well, here's Isaac being threatened about a well, and Isaac just seeks peace. We can have a well over here. Well, I want that one too. Well, we can have a well over here. And when he's left alone, he's blessed. I think that's what it teaches us, is something about his character. I think Isaac was a good guy. I think he was a peacemaker. Let's talk about Isaac's light. Again, we try to do this as the Bible gives it to us. That's why we kind of jump around, and I got to try and come up with some kind of title. But in chapter 26, toward the end of it, God confirms his covenant with Isaac again. There are 3 times that God does this. In chapter 25 and verse 11, God blessed Abraham's son, Isaac. In chapter 26, in verse 3, dwell in this land, God said, and I will be with you and bless you, for to you and your descendants I will give these lands, as I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And then again, here in chapter 26 and verse 24, and the Lord appeared to Isaac that same night, the same night that he settled on that one well and finally had the space to live peaceably. And he said to him, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. So 3 times God confirms his covenant with Isaac. And Abimelech, just like he did with his father, just like Laban did with his son-in-law Jacob, saw that Isaac was blessed of God and wanted to be a part of it. They saw that Isaac was a man devoted to Jehovah God and that Jehovah God was blessing him. And they didn't want problems with them because of that. And so Abimelech came to him and made peace. And Isaac made this last well, had it dug. And it's in that same spot that his father Abraham had made an oath with either the same Abimelech or another Abimelech, where he gave him 7 ewe lambs as a sign of, let's have peace. Stop taking my wells, even Abraham said. And they made peace there. And that is how Beersheba got its name. Beer means well. Sheba means the 7-fold oath, the 7 ewe lambs of his father. Isaac, after having this covenant again with Abimelech, dug this well and said, this is Beersheba. This is the well of the oath. People knew he was with God. Pray that they can say the same about us. And then Isaac is saved. Notice the small parentheses. From himself. Isaac sought, chapter 27, to bless Esau. I believe this is all part of a pattern that we see. Again, I believe. Understand that means it's not necessarily true. I believe that Isaac knew what Rebekah was told by God about blessing the younger, not the older. Yet, Isaac wanted to bless the older. And why? Because Esau was his favorite. Any of that going to come up with his son Jacob and Joseph? Yes. He wanted to bless Esau. What did Rebekah do? She schemed and tricked him. Isaac said to Esau, I'm not long of this world. Go out and catch me some food. Bring it back to me. Prepare it how you know I like it, my son, and I will bless you. Rebekah heard this. When Esau was still gone, she made the food like he liked it, and she dressed up Jacob with animal pelts on his arms and his chest to make him seem like he would feel like Esau, because apparently Isaac was nearly blind. And hopefully you know the story. Jacob went before Isaac, pretending to be Esau. He ate the food and he said, oh yeah. He reached out and he touched the animal fur on the arm that they had attached to Jacob's arm. And he says, yeah, that's my hairy boy, Esau. And he gave the blessing to Jacob. And then Esau came home and said, I'm here, Daddy. And Isaac went, what? Here's why I believe he knew all along, and why I think Isaac was saved from himself. When he found out that he had been tricked and had blessed Jacob inappropriately, why couldn't he simply have taken it back? He's not a Persian, is he, that once he says something, it's required of law, there can be no change? It would seem like he'd be able to say, you cheated me. Esau, come here and let me bless you. But he doesn't do that, does he? Instead, he gives Esau a prophecy. And he basically says, you're going to be a mighty man. You're going to be a bit of a wild man. And your brother's going to dominate you, but the day will come when you break free. It's very similar to what was promised and told to Ishmael. Again, the parallels are very interesting. And yet, in the next chapter, what does he do? He blesses Jacob again. I believe that Rebekah, through deceit, I'm not saying deceit's a good thing, but I think she reminded him of what God had said, and Isaac, when he had that checkup from the neck up, got it right and stayed with that course. Here's another reason I think that. Immediately after that, Isaac sends Jacob up to, guess where? Haran, the homeland of Rebekah's father and the people of Abraham who worshiped Jehovah God. What had Esau done? Esau was a man of the world, so he had himself 2 wives from the Hittites. And it said they had no shortage of problem from those wives. So what did they do with Jacob, the son of promise? They sent him up to find a wife beholden to Jehovah God. Therefore, so many lessons, brethren. Isaac, like his father, stumbled. Isaac, like his father, was faithful. Isaac had some problems between the children, as Abraham did. And Isaac was buried by his sons like his father. I'm going to try and be quick. I know time is getting away from us. I didn't think I'd have near enough time to talk about Isaac, and here I am over. I apologize a little bit. What can we learn about Isaac? I think Isaac teaches us, again, from a lot of what we don't hear, of what it means to be a faithful person of God. Life just goes on. There's not a lot of information about Isaac. Why? He was raised in a Christian home, if you get my drift, and he lived a Christian life. As Dennis and I were talking about this morning, would you go to see a movie, brethren? It's about an airplane, and it filled up with people. It went down the runway. It took off into the skies. It traveled several hours, and then it landed, and all the people got off. End credits. No. Well, what was Isaac's life? He was raised in a God-fearing home. He appears to have been, in general, a God-fearing man. Not perfect, but faithful. And then he died. I think that's what we see there. There's nothing dismissive about that. Brethren, instead, I think there's something beautiful about that. I think if the only thing that would be said about me at my death is he was a faithful child of God, I don't think there'd be anything greater you could say about me. Consider Isaac. A simple message, a simple life, blessed life. This evening, if you're not a Christian, God calls you to himself with his great love. His greatest desire is that you be saved, that you deal with your sin problem. He provided all the means of being saved. He's told you what you need to know. It's all here in the book. He's told you what you must do, all here. If you understand, why not this evening? If you don't understand, please talk to someone. Don't leave tonight without talking, because we never know what the future may hold. Christians, Isaac lived a simple life of obedience, it looks like, seeking peace and looking to move the will of God forward. Brethren, let us aspire to that. As Paul said, let us lead quiet lives, working with our own hands, minding our own business, working the will of God forward. If you haven't been doing that, turn back. If there's anything we can do to help you, we'd ask that you come. Together we stand and sing.